There is a place in the Pacific Ocean where the very earth seems to hold its breath, a landscape sculpted by primordial fire and consecrated by human blood. It is a place of black sand, jagged rock, and hollowed-out hills that whisper with the ghosts of a battle that has, in many ways, never truly ended. In the spring of 1945, this island had a name that would be seared into the consciousness of a generation: Iwo Jima. But to the men who fought there, it had other names. They called it the Sulphur Island. They called it Hell with the Fire Out. And in the Central Highlands, a twisted labyrinth of volcanic rock and fortified caves, they gave one sector a name that was brutally, terrifyingly accurate: the Meatgrinder. Imagine yourself there, in late February 1945. The air is thick with the metallic tang of cordite and the gut-wrenching stench of death, a smell so pervasive it clings to your uniform, your skin, your very soul. The sky, a hazy gray, is constantly rent by the shriek of artillery shells, both outgoing and incoming, a deafening symphony of destruction. You are a United States Marine, 19 years old, and you have been fighting for what feels like an eternity. The initial shock of the beach landing, a chaotic scramble through black ash under a rain of mortar fire, has faded into a dull, persistent state of terror. Now, you face the Meatgrinder. It is not a single point on a map. It is a complex, three-dimensional puzzle of death, engineered by a brilliant and ruthless Japanese general. To your front is Hill 382, its slopes honeycombed with machine gun nests and mortar pits. To your right, a fortified position the men have grimly nicknamed Turkey Knob, from which heavy weapons can fire down into your ranks. And between them lies a low, bowl-shaped basin they call the amphitheater, a natural killing field where every rock and crevice hides a Japanese defender. These positions are not isolated. They are connected by a vast, unseen network of tunnels, allowing Japanese soldiers to vanish from one bunker and reappear in another, striking from the flanks or the rear. You clear a pillbox with a flamethrower, its roaring fire a momentary beacon of victory, only to have machine gun fire erupt from the very same position minutes later as new defenders emerge from the earth. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. He is a ghost in the rock. Your world has shrunk to the few yards of volcanic wasteland in front of you. Progress is not measured in miles, but in agonizing feet. The officers call them touchdowns, a 100-yard dash across open ground, a mad scramble for cover that costs more lives than any sane person would deem acceptable. Your company, which landed 240 men strong just days ago, can now barely muster a platoon. Boys who were sharing jokes on a transport ship are now silent, mangled heaps in the black soil. Command is no longer held by lieutenants and captains. It has fallen to sergeants, to corporals, even to privates who have survived long enough to know where the next burst of fire is likely to come from. This is the reality of Iwo Jima, a grinding, remorseless war of attrition where victory is purchased with human flesh, yard by bloody yard. There is no grand strategy here, no sweeping maneuver. There is only the grim calculus of survival. Can you kill them before they kill you? Will the next shell have your name on it? Can you endure another hour in this sulphurous, God-forsaken landscape? And yet, this is not the image of Iwo Jima that history remembers. The image that has been burned into our collective memory is one of clean, unambiguous triumph. It is a photograph of 6 young men, their faces obscured, straining together to raise a flag on a wind-swept summit. It is a symbol of unity, of courage, of a nation's righteous might pushing back the darkness of tyranny. That single, perfect frame, captured by Joe Rosenthal atop Mount Suribachi, became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It inspired a nation, funded a war bond drive, and became a monument cast in bronze. But that photograph, while capturing a moment of genuine heroism, tells a profound and dangerous lie. It suggests a clear, decisive victory, a climax to the struggle. The truth is that when that flag was raised on the fifth day of the battle, the fight for Iwo Jima had barely begun. The Meatgrinder was still waiting. Thousands of Marines who saw that flag flying would never leave the island alive. The worst of the fighting, the most brutal and soul-crushing combat, was still to come. This is the story of that disconnect. It is the story of how a battle, conceived as a tidy, 10-day strategic necessity, devolved into a 36-day siege of almost unimaginable horror. It is an investigation into a victory so costly that it forced military planners and history itself to ask the most difficult question of all: was it worth it? Our central thesis is this: the Battle of Iwo Jima, immortalized by a single photograph of triumph, was in reality a strategic gamble driven by the relentless logic of total war, where the price of a symbolic and questionably necessary objective was a human catastrophe. It was a battle that revealed not the glory of conquest, but the horrifying attritional endgame of the Pacific War. It was a crucible that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and exposed the terrifying chasm between the cold calculations of strategists and the hellish reality for the men ordered to turn those calculations into fact. To understand Iwo Jima is to understand that some victories are paid for in a currency so precious they forever blur the line between triumph and tragedy. This is the story of the terrible, true price of that iconic flag on the hill. To comprehend the tragedy of Iwo Jima, we must rewind the clock to late 1944. The vast chessboard of the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. The rising sun, which had once cast its shadow from the borders of India to the shores of the Aleutian Islands, was in retreat. The days of Japan's shocking conquests, Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, were a distant memory. An industrial titan had been awakened, and America was now on the offensive, its power growing with each passing month. The strategy guiding this westward surge was known as island hopping. Conceived by Admiral Chester Nimitz, it was a pragmatic and brutal solution to the immense challenge of crossing the Pacific. The Japanese Empire had fortified hundreds of islands, turning them into unsinkable aircraft carriers and bastions of their defensive perimeter. To attack every single one would be a logistical nightmare, a war of 100 years. So, Nimitz's plan was to leapfrog. The Allies would seize only those islands deemed strategically vital, those with deep-water anchorages or, more importantly, land flat enough for an airfield. The rest, cut off from supply lines and reinforcements, would be left to wither on the vine. It was a strategy that worked, but it was anything but clean. Each hop was a bloody education. In November 1943, at Tarawa, the Marines learned in the most horrific way imaginable that naval bombardment alone could not neutralize a well-dug-in defender. Thousands were cut down wading ashore, a bitter lesson in the necessity of amphibious tractors and close air support. In the Marianas, in the summer of 1944, the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided the crucial prize, air bases within range of the Japanese home islands. But it came at a staggering cost and introduced the world to the horror of mass civilian suicides driven by imperial propaganda. And then came Peleliu in September 1944. Expected to be a 4-day skirmish, it turned into a 2-month nightmare of cave-to-cave fighting against a new, terrifying Japanese defensive doctrine. These experiences forged the myth of the Pacific War in the American mind. It was a myth of righteous, unstoppable momentum. The American fighting man, the Marine, was seen as an invincible force, backed by an avalanche of steel from the world's greatest industrial power. Each island was a bloody but necessary stepping stone on an inevitable march to Tokyo. The narrative was one of progress, of a difficult job being done. And within this narrative, Iwo Jima was just the next logical step. It was a small, seemingly insignificant speck of volcanic rock. On the grand strategic maps in Pearl Harbor and Washington, D.C., and it was a problem to be solved, an objective to be taken. The prevailing belief, fueled by a mixture of confidence and hard-won experience, was that this would be another tough, but ultimately swift operation. Planners for Operation Detachment, the code name for the invasion, estimated it would last between 5 and 10 days. This myth of a swift, manageable battle was born from the strategic imperative of a new weapon, a silver behemoth that was meant to win the war, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was the most advanced aircraft of its time, a technological marvel capable of flying higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it. From the newly captured bases in the Marianas, fleets of B-29s began their punishing 3,000-mile round trips to bomb the industrial heart of Japan. But there was a fatal flaw in this grand aerial strategy. The journey was at the absolute edge of the bomber's range. Every gallon of fuel was precious. Every mechanical failure, every encounter with a Japanese fighter, every burst of anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo became a life-or-death gamble. Crews in damaged planes had two terrifying options: ditch in the vast, unforgiving Pacific, with almost no chance of rescue, or turn back early, failing their mission. The losses were becoming unsustainable. Furthermore, to provide fighter escort for the bombers, P-51 Mustangs that could protect them from Japanese interceptors, the Allies needed a base much closer to Japan. And there, perfectly situated halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, lay Iwo Jima. To the strategic planners, it was the perfect solution. A way station, an emergency landing strip, a fighter base. Its capture was not just desirable, it was deemed essential to the success of this strategic bombing campaign, the very strategy that was supposed to bring Japan to its knees without a costly invasion of the home islands. The capture of this 8-square-mile island, they argued, would save countless American lives in the air. The myth was therefore not just one of military momentum, but of strategic salvation. Taking Iwo Jima would make the air war safer and more effective. The problem, the antagonist in our story, was that the Japanese understood the island's value just as keenly, and the man they sent to defend it was not a typical, tradition-bound general. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was a different kind of warrior. He was an aristocrat, a poet, and, most critically, a man who had spent time in the United States as a military attaché. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit, the endless fields of American farmland. The sheer industrial might of the nation Japan was now fighting. Unlike many of his peers, Kuribayashi harbored no illusions. He knew Japan could not win a conventional war against America. He knew he could not defeat the invasion force that would inevitably come to his island. But he could do something else. He could make the price of victory so catastrophically high, so unendurably bloody, that the American people's will to fight would shatter. Studying the lessons of Saipan and Peleliu, he recognized the futility of the traditional Japanese defense. The glorious banzai charge, a wave of screaming soldiers with bayonets fixed, was a suicidal waste of manpower against American machine guns. Defending the beaches was equally pointless. It simply concentrated his forces where American naval guns could annihilate them. So Kuribayashi devised a new doctrine, a strategy of maximum attrition. He would cede the beaches to the invaders. He would let them come ashore, crowding them into the open killing grounds he had prepared. His new battlefield would not be the island's surface, but its interior. For nearly a year, under his command, the 21,000 Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima transformed the island into the most formidable fortress in the Pacific. They dug deep. Using Korean forced laborers and their own men, they carved over 11 miles of tunnels through the soft volcanic rock, connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts. They built hundreds of reinforced concrete pillboxes, camouflaged so perfectly they were invisible from the air and sea. Every gun was sighted not just for defense, but for mutual support, creating interlocking fields of fire that could sweep every inch of the island. Kuribayashi's orders were simple and chilling. There would be no surrender. There would be no glorious, wasteful banzai charges. Every soldier was to stay in his position and fight to the death. He issued courageous battle vows, demanding that each of his men kill 10 Americans before they themselves were killed. The island was no longer a military outpost. It was to be a collective tomb for his garrison and a graveyard for as many American Marines as possible. He was not fighting to win the battle for Iwo Jima. He was fighting to lose it so horrifically that America would lose its stomach for the war. This was the world that existed just before the storm broke. On one side, an American task force of over 700 ships and 100,000 men, confident in their power, believing in the myth of a short, sharp fight for a vital strategic prize. On the other, a volcanic fortress manned by 21,000 disciplined soldiers, led by a brilliant and pragmatic general, all committed to a strategy of suicidal, attritional defense. The stage was set. The myth of a 10-day operation was about to collide with the reality of Kuribayashi's fortress. The first domino was about to fall, not on the beaches, but in the minds of the American naval commanders who made a fateful decision that would seal the fate of thousands. The dawn of February 19, 1945, broke over a scene of awesome and terrible power. The largest fleet ever assembled for a single amphibious operation in the Pacific surrounded Iwo Jima. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stood off the coast, their guns forming a ring of steel around the small, pork-chop-shaped island. For the tens of thousands of Marines crammed into the landing craft, circling in the churning sea, this was the prelude to invasion, a familiar ritual of overwhelming firepower. They had seen it before, the softening up, a naval bombardment so intense it was supposed to pulverize every defensive position, shatter the enemy's morale, and pave the way for a relatively easy landing. This was a core tenet of American amphibious doctrine, a lesson learned in blood at Tarawa. Major General Harry Schmidt, the commander of the V Amphibious Corps, understood the challenge ahead. He had studied the intelligence reports, seen the aerial photographs, and knew the Japanese had been digging in for months. He requested a full 10 days of continuous round-the-clock naval bombardment to systematically dismantle Kuribayashi's fortress before his Marines set foot on the island. 10 days to turn the rock to rubble. 10 days to save the lives of his men. He was given 3. This decision, made at the highest levels of the U.S. Navy, was the turning point of the battle before the first shot was even fired by an infantryman. It was the inciting incident, the critical domino that set in motion the entire tragedy to come. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the overall fleet commander, had competing priorities. He was concerned about the Japanese fleet, the potential for air and submarine attacks on his massive, exposed armada. Lingering for 10 days off Iwo Jima felt like an unacceptable risk. Furthermore, there was a pervasive, almost arrogant belief within the Navy that 3 days of heavy shelling was more than enough to neutralize any defenses on such a tiny island. This underestimation of Kuribayashi's engineering and his soldiers' fanaticism was a catastrophic miscalculation. The bombardment that did occur was impressive in its scale, but tragically ineffective in its execution. For 3 days, warships hurled thousands of shells at the island, but much of the firing was at long range, and cloudy weather obscured targets. The shells churned the surface of the island, rearranging the loose volcanic soil, but they did little to harm the deeply buried, heavily reinforced concrete bunkers that formed the backbone of Kuribayashi's defense. The Japanese soldiers simply waded deep within their tunnels, enduring the thunderous barrage, their weapons protected, their resolve hardening. The American myth of overwhelming firepower was failing its first, most crucial test. The fortress remained intact. At 9:00 a.m. on D-Day, the ramps of the landing craft dropped. The first waves of Marines charged forward, expecting to meet a hail of machine gun fire at the water's edge. Instead, they were met with an unnerving, eerie silence. The beach was quiet. The only sounds were the roar of their own engines, the churning of the surf, and the shouting of NCOs. For a moment, a fleeting, hopeful moment, It seemed the bombardment had worked after all. Perhaps the Japanese were all dead or stunned into submission. But the island itself immediately began to fight back. This was not the firm, white sand of a tropical paradise. It was coarse, black volcanic ash. It didn't back down. With every step, the Marines sank up to their ankles, their boots filling with the gritty, heavy material. A desperate run became a lung-bursting, exhausting slog. Worse still was the terrain. The beach rose sharply into a steep, 15-foot-high terrace of this loose ash. Men, burdened with over 60 pounds of gear, had to claw their way up this crumbling slope, completely exposed. Vehicles, the amphibious tractors and tanks meant to provide immediate fire support, bogged down, their tracks spinning uselessly in the black morass. The landing beaches quickly became a scene of utter chaos and congestion. Men, vehicles, and supplies piled up in a tangled, vulnerable mass at the base of the terrace. They were perfect targets. And it was at this exact moment, with the beaches hopelessly clogged and the Marines at their most disorganized, that General Kuribayashi sprung his trap. He gave the order. From the heights of Mount Suribachi to the south, and from hundreds of perfectly concealed positions in the highlands to the north, all of Kuribayashi's pre-sighted artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened up at once. The silence was shattered by a deafening, terrifying roar. The beaches, which had been quiet moments before, erupted in fountains of black ash, fire, and steel. Shells rained down with pinpoint accuracy, bracketing the landing zones. Mortar rounds dropped directly into the masses of struggling men. Machine gun fire from bunkers the Navy's big guns had never touched crisscrossed the terraces, scything through the ranks of the first waves. The myth of a softened island was shredded in minutes. This was a meticulously planned ambush on a colossal scale. Kuribayashi had allowed the Americans to land, just as he intended. He had waited until they were at their most vulnerable, stuck in the killing jar he had designed for them. The Marines were trapped. Behind them was the sea. In front of them was the impossible terrace and an unseen enemy pouring down a torrent of fire. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The only way out was forward. On the far right of the landing beaches, the situation was even worse. Here, the Marines of the 4th Division slammed into a fortified area known simply as the Quarry. It was a heavily defended maze of rock and pillboxes that could enfilade the entire beach. Major General Clifton Cates, the division's commander, had foreseen the danger before the invasion even began, prophetically stating, "You know, if I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad of the right-hand company of the right-hand battalion, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in." His words proved hauntingly accurate. The quarry became a charnel house, a place where companies were bled white in frontal assaults against an enemy they could not see. By sheer grit and unimaginable courage, the Marines pushed inland. Bulldozers were brought ashore under fire to carve paths through the terraces, allowing tanks and other vehicles to finally get off the beach. The 28th Marine Regiment began the arduous task of trying to envelop and cut off Mount Suribachi, but the damage was done. The first day's objectives were nowhere close to being met. The neat lines drawn on maps in Pearl Harbor had dissolved into a bloody, chaotic scramble for survival. By the end of D-Day, the Amphibious Corps had suffered nearly 2,500 casualties. The inciting incident was not just the landing itself, but the dawning, horrifying realization that washed over every Marine, from private to general. All their assumptions had been wrong. The bombardment had failed. The terrain was a nightmare. And the enemy was not a demoralized remnant, but a well-led, deeply entrenched, and fanatically determined foe with a brilliant defensive plan. The 10-day battle was a fantasy. They were now locked in a struggle against a fortress, and the only way to take it was to dismantle it piece by bloody piece, paying for every pillbox, every cave, every yard of volcanic rock with the lives of their friends. The easy victory promised by the planners had vanished in the smoke and chaos of the black sand beaches. The true battle of Iwo Jima, the grinding war of attrition that Kuribayashi had meticulously designed, had just begun. The battle for Iwo Jima now entered its second, more brutal phase, the systematic and bloody autopsy of a living fortress. With the beaches secured at a terrible cost, the Marines were forced to conduct a forensic breakdown of Kuribayashi's defenses, not with maps and pointers in a briefing room, but with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and their own bodies. The ripple effect of the disastrous opening day spread across the island, as the false hope of a quick victory was replaced by the grim reality of a slow, agonizing crawl. Nowhere was this dichotomy between perception and reality more potent than at Mount Suribachi. For 5 days, the 28th Marines fought their way around the base of the 550-foot dormant volcano. It was a fortress in itself, ringed with over 70 reinforced concrete emplacements and connected by tunnels. The fighting was savage, but on the morning of February 23rd, D-4, a patrol finally reached the summit and found it surprisingly lightly defended. A small American flag was raised, and a few hours later it was replaced by a much larger one. It was this second flag raising that photographer Joe Rosenthal captured in a single immortal frame. The photograph was an instant sensation. Transmitted around the world, it appeared on the front page of nearly every American newspaper. It was a symbol of hope, a powerful piece of propaganda that suggested the battle was won, that the hardest part was over. It electrified the American public and spurred a massive, successful war bond drive. The twist, the brutal truth known only to the men on the island, was that the capture of Suribachi was a prelude, not a conclusion. Kuribayashi, in his strategic brilliance, had never intended to make his final stand on the mountain. He knew it was an isolated, obvious target. Using his tunnel network, he had already withdrawn the bulk of its defenders to his main defensive belt in the north. The flag on Suribachi flew over an empty victory, while the real war, the fight for the northern highlands, for the Meatgrinder, was just beginning. The photograph, a symbol of triumph, created a ripple effect of false optimism back home, masking the escalating horror on the island itself. With Suribachi secured, the 3 Marine divisions turned their attention north, advancing abreast across the island's waste. And here they entered the true heart of Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece. This was not a linear battle of trenches like those of World War I. It was a 3-dimensional nightmare. American forces would launch a frontal assault on a pillbox, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from another unseen bunker to their flank. They would destroy that bunker, only to be hit by mortar fire from a hidden pit to their rear. Every position was designed to be mutually supporting. There was no front line. The battlefield was everywhere. The autopsy of these defenses revealed their devilish ingenuity. Blockhouses were built with concrete walls several feet thick, impervious to all but a direct hit from a battleship's main guns. Entrances were angled to protect from explosions and flamethrowers. Small, concealed ports allowed machine gunners to fire across fields of engagement, then disappear back into the tunnel system before American artillery could zero in. Japanese soldiers would emerge from hidden spider holes, one-man foxholes covered with a lid, to shoot Marines in the back long after an area had been declared secure. This forced a grim evolution in American tactics. The battle became the work of small, specialized teams. A rifle squad would lay down suppressing fire, while another team, armed with a 75-pound flamethrower, the Zippo, would crawl forward. The operator, one of the most vulnerable and heroic men on the battlefield, would hose the opening of a bunker with liquid fire, silencing the occupants. Then, a demolition team would run forward and throw satchel charges into the entrance to seal it for good. Sometimes, this wasn't enough. The Japanese would simply open another entrance connected by their tunnels. Sherman tanks, including the modified Zippo Shermans with massive flamethrowers, were brought in to blast positions at point-blank range, or to physically collapse cave entrances by churning their treads over them. The ripple effect of this type of warfare was profound, both tactically and psychologically. The casualty rate was astronomical. Replacements, fresh-faced teenagers with minimal training, were rushed to the front lines, often lasting only hours before being killed or wounded. The command structure of entire companies was wiped out, leaving corporals and privates in charge, making life-or-death decisions. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the sight of unrelenting carnage began to break even the most hardened veterans. A condition they called combat fatigue, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, incapacitated thousands. Men who were physically unharmed would simply shut down, their minds unable to process any more of the horror. As the American advance stalled in the Meatgrinder in the east and against a series of fortified ridges in the center and west, the attritional nature of Kuribayashi's plan became horrifyingly clear. He was trading lives for time, and he was exacting a terrible price. By early March, after nearly 2 weeks of fighting, the Marines had suffered over 16,000 casualties, including 3,000 dead. The Japanese had lost more, nearly 14,000 men, but for a defender, these were acceptable ratios. The American logistical and medical chains were strained to their breaking point. This desperation led to tactical innovation. General Graves Erskine of the 3rd Marine Division noticed the Japanese had learned the American rhythm. A heavy artillery barrage at dawn, followed by a predictable infantry assault. He decided to break the pattern. On March 7th, he ordered a surprise attack at 5 a.m. with no preparatory bombardment. The gamble worked. His Marines caught the defenders off guard and captured a key piece of high ground, Hill 362C, cracking a section of the Japanese line. But every success created new problems. This advance isolated a pocket of die-hard Japanese defenders that became known as Cushman's Pocket, another miniature Meatgrinder that would have to be reduced at great cost. Kuribayashi, seeing his main line collapsing, knew the end was near. But he held his men to their vows. He refused to allow wasteful, large-scale bonsai charges, though some of his subordinate commanders, in their desperation, ignored his orders and led suicidal attacks that were mowed down by Marine firepower. Instead, he consolidated his remaining forces in the northwest of the island, in a deep, treacherous ravine that would be his final fortress. The battle had reached its endgame. The forensic autopsy was nearly complete. The Americans had unraveled the secrets of Kuribayashi's fortress, but the price of that knowledge was written in a casualty list that was already the worst in Marine Corps history. The final dominoes were about to fall in a place the survivors would call Bloody Gorge. By mid-March, the island of Iwo Jima was a shattered, smoking ruin. The relentless American advance had compressed the last vestiges of Japanese resistance into a few isolated pockets. The largest of these was centered on General Kuribayashi's command post in a deep ravine in the northwest, a final bastion of defiance that the Marines grimly christened Bloody Gorge. The men who had to assault this final position were not the same ones who had landed a month earlier. They were exhausted, traumatized survivors, their ranks filled with inexperienced replacements. The fighting devolved into its most primal form: close-quarters combat with grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers in a labyrinth of caves and chasms. American commanders, seeing the futility of more suicidal resistance, began to employ psychological warfare. Loudspeakers blared messages in Japanese, promising good treatment for prisoners. Translated letters from captured Japanese soldiers were dropped, urging their former comrades to surrender, arguing it was more honorable to live for the emperor than to die like rats underground. These efforts were almost entirely fruitless. The code of Bushido, reinforced by Kuribayashi's iron will, held fast. Of the original 21,000 defenders, only 216 would be taken prisoner during the battle. The rest chose death. On March 23rd, Kuribayashi sent his final message to Tokyo: "All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo." His ultimate fate remains a mystery. It is believed he either committed ritual suicide or removed his officer's insignia and died anonymously, leading one of the final, desperate charges. On the night of March 25th, some 200 to 300 Japanese soldiers, many of them walking wounded armed with swords and spears, crept out of Bloody Gorge. They launched a final surprise attack not on the Marine front lines, but on an encampment of Army pilots and Navy construction battalions near the airfields. The chaotic, hand-to-hand fighting in the dark was the last organized act of resistance. By dawn, it was over. The battle for Iwo Jima, 36 agonizing days after it began, had finally ended. Now we must zoom out from the carnage and confront the legacy. The final butcher's bill was staggering. The United States Marine Corps suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, including 6,921 killed. It remains the deadliest single battle in the Corps' history. The Navy suffered an additional 2,800 casualties. For the Japanese, the losses were near total. Of the 21,000 defenders, it is estimated that over 19,000 were killed. Iwo Jima holds a grim, unique distinction in the Pacific War. It was the only major battle where the American forces suffered more total casualties than the Japanese. This brings us to the central, haunting question that defines the battle's legacy. Was it worth it? The official justification, the one offered by planners and repeated for decades, is an emphatic yes. The argument rests entirely on the B-29 superfortress. From March to the end of the war, 2,251 B-29s made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's newly captured airfields. It is claimed that these landings saved the lives of nearly 24,000 American airmen who would have otherwise perished in the Pacific. On the surface, this is a powerful argument. The lives of 24,000 highly trained flight crews weighed against the 26,000 Marine and Navy casualties. A brutal, but perhaps justifiable, military calculation. However, a closer look complicates this narrative. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army and even some naval strategists question this justification. Many of the B-29 landings were not for critical, life-threatening emergencies, but for more routine issues like fuel consumption. The island was never effectively used as a base for P-51 Mustang fighter escorts as originally planned. Advances in drop tank technology soon allowed the fighters to make the full trip from the Marianas. Critics argued that the strategic bombing campaign itself was of questionable effectiveness in breaking Japan's will to fight, and that other options, like the naval blockade and the impending entry of the Soviet Union into the war, were more decisive factors. The argument emerged that Iwo Jima was a battle fought for a purpose that was, at best, overstated and, at worst, strategically redundant. It was a relic of a plan that was already becoming obsolete. The universal lesson of Iwo Jima, then, is a chilling one about the momentum of war and the danger of the sunk cost fallacy. Once the massive machinery of Operation Detachment was set in motion, once the honor of the Marine Corps was committed, there was no turning back. The objective had to be taken, regardless of the cost. The initial underestimation of the defenses, the failure of the preliminary bombardment, these early mistakes created a situation where victory could only be achieved through brute force and horrific attrition. It serves as a timeless warning for military and political leaders, a caution against allowing symbolic objectives and institutional pride to overshadow cold, rational strategic analysis. It's a lesson that echoes through the protracted conflicts of the modern era, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, where the initial reasons for engagement become lost in the desperate need to justify the sacrifices already made. In modern times, Iwo Jima forces us to confront the way we sanitize and remember conflict. We prefer the clean, heroic image of the flag raising to the grimy, terrifying reality of the Meatgrinder. The battle teaches us that behind every iconic photograph of victory lies a landscape of unphotographed suffering. It reminds us that war is not an equation on a chalkboard where assets are traded. It is a profoundly human affair fought by young men who are asked to do the impossible, to endure the unendurable, for reasons they are often told are vital, but which history may later judge to be tragically flawed. In the end, the true legacy of Iwo Jima does not belong to the generals or the strategists who debate its necessity in the comfortable remove of history. It belongs to the men who fought there. It is etched in the black sands of the island and carried in the memories of the few who survived. The victory was not won by a grand strategic plan, but by the cumulative courage of thousands of individuals, each fighting their own private war for survival, for the man next to them. The ultimate lesson is that the human spirit can triumph over any obstacle, but it is the solemn duty of those in power to ensure that such spirit is never squandered on a battle that did not need to be fought. The flag on Suribachi remains a symbol of American courage, but the ghosts of Iwo Jima whisper a timeless cautionary tale about the terrible, terrible price of victory.